Stay with me, just a little longer. The mafia boss whispered from his hospital bed. Nina Carter didn't answer right away. She stood beside him, one hand still holding the warm towel she had just used to wipe the tension from his brow, her eyes lingering on his face longer than necessary. Outside, the Connecticut night pressed quietly against the tall windows, wind brushing dry leaves across the stone terrace like a slow, restless tide. Inside, the room carried the quiet weight of something fragile, something neither of them had fully named yet. Adrian, she said softly this time, no longer correcting herself back to Mr. DeLuca. That shift had happened somewhere over the past few weeks, unnoticed but permanent. His eyes opened, tired but aware. You're still here. I told you I would be. She pulled the chair closer and sat down, leaning slightly forward, her voice steady but warm. And I'm not going anywhere tonight. For a moment, he just looked at her, not as a patient looks at a caregiver, not as a powerful man evaluates someone in his orbit, but as a man who was trying to understand why someone would stay when they had every reason to leave. You say that like it's simple, he murmured. It is simple, Nina replied gently. You just don't believe it yet. She reached for the glass on the nightstand, lifting it carefully. Drink a little. You need it if you're going to start therapy again tomorrow. He hesitated, then obeyed without argument. That, too, had changed. The man who once gave orders now followed quiet instructions from a woman half his size without resistance. After a few sips, he leaned back against the pillows, his breathing slightly uneven. Nina adjusted the blanket over him, tucking it with small, practiced movements that carried more care than words ever could. You're stronger today, she said, watching him closely. Your shoulders didn't tense when you sat up. That's progress. He let out a low breath, something between a scoff and a sigh. Progress, he repeated, like the word didn't quite belong to him. I used to run 3 companies at once. I could walk into a room and decide what happened in it before anyone else spoke. His jaw tightened slightly. Now I need help to sit up straight. Nina didn't look away. And tomorrow, she said calmly, you'll sit up without help. And the day after that, you'll stand. He turned his head toward her, searching her face. You really believe that? Yes, she said without hesitation. I don't say things I don't mean. Silence settled again, but it felt different now, less heavy, more honest. Adrian stared at the ceiling for a long moment, then spoke again, his voice lower. You know what I think about when I'm lying here like this? Nina didn't interrupt. She just waited. I think about how quickly everything disappears, he said. Power, control, respect, all of it. His lips pressed into a thin line. It turns out, it doesn't take much to bring a man down. Just one moment. One mistake. Nina folded her hands in her lap, listening. I built everything carefully, he continued. Every deal, every connection. I made sure no one could touch me. A faint, humorless exhale followed. And now look at me. Her gaze softened. I am looking at you. He finally turned his head back toward her, something raw flickering in his eyes. No, he said quietly. You're looking at what's left of me. Nina leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but gentle. That's not true. It is. His tone didn't rise, but there was a weight to it now. I can't walk. I can't protect anything. I can't even protect myself. A pause. Then, almost reluctantly, I've never felt useless before. The word hung in the air longer than either of them expected. Nina didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she reached out and rested her hand lightly over his. You're not useless, she said, her voice steady, grounded. You're injured. That's a polite way of saying the same thing. No, she said, shaking her head slightly. It's not the same thing at all. Useless means there's nothing left. Injured means there's something worth fixing. He looked at her again, more intently this time. You're still here, she continued. You're still thinking, still fighting, still angry about what you've lost. That doesn't sound like a useless man to me. Adrian held her gaze, and for a brief second, the hardened edges of him seemed to shift. You talk like you've seen this before. Nina hesitated, then nodded. My father, she said quietly. He lost everything after the factory shut down. Said the same thing you just said. That he was useless. She gave a small, reflective smile. He wasn't. He just didn't know who he was without the job. And did he figure it out? Eventually. Her eyes softened with memory. But it took someone reminding him he was more than what he could do. Adrian absorbed that in silence. Then, slowly, something changed in his expression, not strength, not yet, but something close to humility. "You've taken care of me, better than anyone ever has," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual control. "You don't rush. You don't look at me like I'm a burden." A faint shake of his head followed. "I've had people around me my whole life, Nina. People who were paid to stay, but none of them stayed like this." Nina felt her chest tighten slightly. "It's my job," she said softly, though even she knew that wasn't the full truth anymore. "No," he said, more firmly than before. "It stopped being just a job a long time ago." His eyes held hers. "I see that." She didn't respond right away. Adrian exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting again toward the ceiling. "You've done everything right," he continued. "You've been patient, careful, kind." A pause. "And I've done nothing." "That's not fair," Nina said immediately. "It is." His voice softened again, but the weight remained. "You're the one holding everything together in this room. And I'm just lying here." "You're healing," she corrected. He gave a quiet, almost bitter smile. "It doesn't feel like that." Nina shifted closer, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "Healing doesn't always feel like progress," she said. "Sometimes it feels like failure before it gets better. That doesn't mean it is." He turned his head slightly, watching her again. "You're not the man you were 6 months ago," she added. "But that doesn't mean you're less. It just means you're in the middle of something. And what if I don't make it out of the middle?" Nina didn't hesitate this time. "Then I'll be right here with you while you try." That landed deeper than anything else she had said. For a long moment, Adrian said nothing. Then, quietly, almost as if the words had been waiting behind his ribs for weeks, he spoke. "Stay with me, just a little longer." Nina's fingers tightened slightly over his hand. This time she didn't freeze. "I will," she said. And for the first time since she had met him, Adrian DeLuca closed his eyes not out of exhaustion, but with something close to trust. Outside, the wind carried the last of the autumn leaves across the terrace. Inside, the man who had once controlled everything lay still beneath the covers, and the woman who had come into his life as a stranger sat beside him, quietly holding together the pieces he thought he had already lost. That night, something shifted not in his body, but in her heart. Morning came slowly to the DeLuca estate, not with noise or urgency, but with a quiet kind of discipline that had clearly existed long before Nina ever arrived. The staff moved like they understood invisible lines where to step, when to speak, what not to notice. By the time Nina crossed the marble hallway with a tray balanced carefully in her hands, the house was already awake, though it never truly felt alive. She pushed open Adrian's bedroom door with her shoulder and stepped inside. The curtains were still drawn, but thin streaks of pale autumn light slipped through the edges, softening the sharpness of the room. He was awake. She could tell before he even spoke. "You're late," Adrian said, his voice rough but steadier than the night before. Nina didn't react to the comment the way she might have weeks ago. Instead, she set the tray down on the side table and glanced at the clock. 3 minutes, she said calmly. "And only because Mrs. Lang insisted I take fresh bread out of the oven instead of reheating yesterday's." He shifted slightly against the pillows, watching her as she moved. "You're defending yourself now." "I'm explaining," she replied, pouring coffee into a small cup and adding just a touch of cream the way he had come to prefer. "There's a difference." A faint trace of something almost like amusement passed through his expression. "I see." Nina carried the tray closer and adjusted the bed, helping him sit up with practiced care. Her hands were steady, her movements efficient, but there was a quiet gentleness in the way she supported his back, in the way she made sure he didn't strain too quickly. "Easy," she murmured. "Don't rush it." "I'm not rushing," he said, though his jaw tightened slightly as he shifted his weight. "I'm just tired of feeling like I'm made of glass." "You're not made of glass," Nina said, handing him the coffee. "You're healing. And healing is slow whether you like it or not." He took the cup, his fingers brushing briefly against hers. The contact lingered just a second longer than necessary before he looked away. "You always talk like that?" "Like what?" "Like everything is going to work out if people just wait long enough." Nina picked up a piece of toast, breaking it gently before placing it on his plate. Not everything works out, she said honestly. But some things do, and those are usually the ones people almost gave up on. He studied her again, the way he had started to do more often lately. You're not what I expected. That makes two of us, she replied, sitting down across from him with her own cup of coffee. For a few minutes, they ate in a quiet that didn't feel empty. The clink of porcelain, the faint hum of the house, the distant sound of someone moving furniture somewhere downstairs, all of it blended into something almost normal. You should call your mother tonight, Adrian said suddenly, breaking the silence. Nina raised an eyebrow. You're still thinking about that? I told you, he said, taking another slow sip. Time runs out faster than people expect. She watched him for a moment. You talk like you've already lost something. A shadow crossed his face, quick but real. Everyone has, he said. Some just notice it more. Nina didn't push further. Instead, she stood and moved toward the window, pulling the curtains open. Sunlight spilled into the room, bright and clean, cutting through the heaviness that tended to linger in corners. Look at that, she said lightly. Perfect day to stand. Adrian let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh. You're not giving up on that, are you? No, she said, turning back toward him. Because you're not. He didn't answer right away, but something in his posture shifted, subtle but important. The resistance wasn't gone, but it wasn't as solid as before. All right, he said finally. Tell me what to do. Nina stepped closer, her focus sharpening. We'll start small. Just like yesterday. I'll support you, but you do the work. He nodded once. She moved beside him, placing one hand at his shoulder, the other steady at his arm. On 3, she said. 1, 2, 3. Adrian pushed. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't strong, but it was real. His body trembled slightly as he shifted forward, his feet finding the floor, his weight uneven but present. For a moment, he held himself there, suspended between failure and something else. Good, Nina said softly, her voice firm with encouragement. Stay with it. Don't think about falling. Just think about standing. I am standing, he muttered, though his breath came a little heavier now. Then prove it, she said, a hint of a smile touching her voice. He glanced at her. And for the first time that morning, there was something sharper in his eyes. Not anger, not control, but determination. Seconds passed, then a full minute, and he didn't collapse. Nina felt her chest tighten, not with fear this time, but something warmer. That's it, she said quietly. That's how it starts. Adrian slowly lowered himself back onto the bed, his breathing uneven but his expression different. Not victorious, not yet, but changed. You see, she said, handing him a glass of water. Not useless. He took the glass, looking at her over the rim. You're very sure of that. I am. He drank, then set the glass down with care. You keep saying that like it's fact. It is, she replied. He leaned back slightly, studying her again in that quiet, deliberate way. Do you ever get tired of being the strong one? Nina hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. I don't think of it like that. Then how do you think of it? She shrugged lightly. I think of it as doing what needs to be done. Adrian let out a slow breath. You've taken care of me like I matter, he said, his voice quieter now. Most people don't bother unless there's something in it for them. Nina met his gaze. Maybe most people are just tired, she said, tired of giving and not getting anything back. And you're not? I didn't say that, she answered, a faint, honest smile appearing. I just haven't stopped yet. Moments like this don't shout, they stay with you quietly, long after the story moves on. If this scene made you feel something, share your thoughts in the comments right where you're watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to follow more stories like this. And tell me honestly, if you were in Nina's place, would you have done the same? He held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. You're going to make this harder for yourself, he said eventually. Maybe, she admitted. But walking away would be harder. That answer seemed to settle something in him. Downstairs, a door closed, voices murmured, life continuing in its controlled, careful rhythm. But in the room, something had shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough. Adrian leaned back against the pillows, his eyes lingering on her. Nina, Yes? He hesitated, then said quietly, "Thank you." It wasn't a grand statement. It wasn't the kind of thing a man like him probably said often, but it carried weight. Nina nodded once, accepting it without making it bigger than it needed to be. "You're welcome." She turned back to the tray, gathering the empty dishes, her movements calm, grounded. But as she stepped toward the door, she felt it again, that quiet pull, that sense that she was standing at the edge of something she didn't fully understand yet. Behind her, Adrian watched her leave, the sunlight now filling the space she had just occupied. And for the first time in a long time, the room didn't feel like a place he was trapped in. It felt like a place he might one day walk out of. By the third morning, the rhythm between them had settled into something that felt less like obligation and more like understanding. Nina no longer knocked before entering Adrian's room. She moved through the space with quiet certainty, adjusting curtains, checking medication, setting breakfast down with the kind of care that came not from training, but from attention. Adrian noticed everything. "You changed the coffee," he said as she handed him the cup. Nina glanced at him, slightly surprised. "Less cream," she confirmed. "You said it tasted too heavy yesterday." "I didn't think you'd remember." "I remember things that matter," she replied simply, then added with a faint smile, "and things people pretend don't matter." He studied her for a moment, then took a slow sip. "It's better." "Good," she said, turning toward the small dresser where she kept his medication organized. "Then we're making progress in more ways than one." Outside, the morning carried a crisp brightness, the kind that made everything look sharper than it really was. Nina pulled the curtains open just enough to let the light in without overwhelming the room, then returned to his side. "Same plan as yesterday," she said. "We try standing again, maybe a little longer this time." Adrian didn't respond immediately. His gaze had shifted, not to her, but to something on the far side of the room. Nina followed it. On the polished wooden desk near the window sat a stack of documents she hadn't noticed before, along with a thin leather folder left slightly open. It wasn't unusual for things to appear and disappear in that house without explanation, but something about the way Adrian was looking at it made her pause. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if deciding whether or not to speak. "Bring that here," he said finally, nodding toward the desk. Nina hesitated for a brief second, then crossed the room. As she reached for the folder, she noticed a photograph partially tucked beneath the papers. It caught her attention before she could stop herself. A woman stood beside Adrian in the image, elegant, poised, her hand resting lightly on his arm, blonde, mid-30s, dressed in something expensive and understated. On her finger, a ring that was impossible to miss. Nina froze for half a second too long. "Bring it," Adrian repeated, his voice quieter now. She slipped the photo back into place without comment and carried the folder to him, setting it carefully on his lap. "What is it?" "Something I should have dealt with months ago," he said, flipping it open with a stiffness that had less to do with his hands and more to do with what was inside. Nina didn't look right away. She busied herself adjusting his pillow, but her eyes drifted back to spite herself. Legal documents, financial statements, and then, clearly printed near the top of one page, Victoria Hale. The name sat there like something heavy, something that didn't belong in the quiet they had built over the past few weeks. Nina stepped back slightly. "She's important," she said carefully. Adrian let out a low breath that sounded almost like regret. "Important to the people who think they understand how power works," he replied. "Not to me." "That's not what it looks like," Nina said before she could stop herself. His eyes lifted to hers. "What does it look like?" She hesitated, then answered honestly. "It looks like you were going to marry her." The room fell still. For a moment, Adrian didn't move. Then he closed the folder slowly, his gaze dropping to his hands. "That was the plan," he said. Nina felt something tighten in her chest, something she didn't have a name for yet. "And now?" "Now," he said quietly. "I'm lying in a bed I can't get out of, and half the people I trusted are making decisions without me. That doesn't answer the question." He looked up again, this time more directly. "No," he admitted. "It doesn't." Nina folded her arms loosely, more to steady herself than anything else. "You should have told me," she said, not accusing, just stating it. "I didn't think it mattered to you." "That doesn't mean it doesn't matter," she replied. Adrian watched her, something sharper returning to his expression. Why does it matter? The question landed heavier than he intended. Nina looked away first, her eyes drifting toward the window where the light had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the floor. Because I'm here, she said after a moment, and I'm not just doing a job anymore. The words stayed between them, quiet but undeniable. Adrian leaned back slightly, absorbing that. No, he said softly. You're not. Silence stretched again, but it wasn't empty. It carried weight, truth, something fragile and unguarded. After a moment, Nina stepped forward, her voice gentler now. You said people disappear quickly when things fall apart, she reminded him. Maybe that's because they were never really there. And you are? He asked. She met his eyes. I'm still here. That answer settled deeper than the last time she'd said it. Adrian exhaled slowly, then nodded toward the folder. She represents an arrangement, he said, an alliance, something that was supposed to make everything stronger. A faint, almost bitter smile touched his lips. Turns out, strength built that way doesn't hold when things start breaking. Nina listened, her expression steady. So what happens now? He looked at her for a long moment before answering. Now I decide what's actually mine, and what never was. There was something in the way he said it that made the room feel colder for a second, like a door had opened somewhere far beyond Nina's understanding. She stepped closer again, gently placing her hand on his arm. Then, start with this, she said. Stand. He glanced down at her hand, then back up at her face. You're still here, she repeated quietly. That means something didn't break. For a second, something in his expression softened again, the edge fading just enough. All right, he said. Nina moved into position beside him, steady and familiar. On 3, she said, her voice calm. 1, 2, 3. He pushed again. This time, it was stronger. Not steady, not easy, but stronger. His feet met the floor, his weight shifted, and for a brief moment, he stood without immediately reaching for her support. Nina felt her breath catch, but she didn't interrupt. Stay with it, she said softly. Adrian held himself there, his jaw tight, his eyes focused. Seconds stretched, then more. When he finally sat back down, his breathing was heavier, but there was something new in his face. Not just determination, clarity. You were right, he said quietly. I know, Nina replied, a small smile touching her lips. He shook his head slightly. Not about the standing, he said. About the other thing. She tilted her head. Which one? That I'm not useless. Nina didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Instead, she picked up the folder and set it aside on the nightstand, closing it fully this time. Power doesn't just control money, she said softly, almost to herself. It controls people. Adrian watched her carefully. And what do you think controls power? Nina met his gaze again, her voice steady. Choice. The word lingered in the air. Outside, the wind had settled, leaving the trees almost still. Inside, something far less visible had begun to move, and neither of them could pretend anymore that what was growing between them was simple. The message arrived just after noon, at a moment so ordinary Nina almost ignored it. She was in the kitchen, standing at the long marble counter, stirring a pot of chicken soup the way Adrian preferred light broth, a little thyme, nothing too heavy. The house was quiet in that controlled way it always was, with staff moving in distant corners and voices kept low out of habit rather than instruction. Her phone, left near the edge of the counter, lit up once. Unknown number. No name, no hesitation. If you stay, you'll be his weakness. Nina didn't touch the screen at first. She simply stared at it, the words settling into her chest like something unwelcome but familiar. The spoon in her hand slowed, then stopped altogether. Everything okay? The voice came from the doorway. She turned slightly to see Mrs. Lang, the house manager, watching her with the kind of polite concern that didn't invite real answers. Yeah, Nina said, a little too quickly. Just a wrong number. Mrs. Lang studied her for a moment, then nodded once. Lunch is expected upstairs in 15 minutes. I'll bring it up. The older woman hesitated just a second longer, then turned and walked away, her footsteps quiet but deliberate against the polished floor. Nina exhaled slowly once she was alone again. She picked up the phone, read the message one more time, then deleted it. The screen went blank, but the words didn't disappear as easily. Weakness. She turned back to the stove, forcing her hands to move again, to focus on something tangible. Soup, bread, tea, simple things, safe things. But her mind didn't stay quiet. By the time she carried the tray upstairs, the thought had settled into something heavier, not fear exactly, but awareness. Adrian was sitting up when she entered, already dressed in a dark long-sleeve shirt instead of the usual hospital wear. It was a small change, but it didn't go unnoticed. "You're early," he said, watching her as she crossed the room. "You're dressed," she replied, setting the tray down. "That's new. I got tired of looking like a patient," he said. "Figured I'd start acting like something else." Nina glanced at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "Careful. That sounds like confidence. Don't get used to it." She began arranging the tray, her movements steady, but her thoughts still circling the message. Adrian noticed the shift almost immediately. Something's off. She didn't look up. "Nothing's off. Nina." The way he said her name quiet, certain made it difficult to ignore. She paused, then sighed lightly. "Just a message." "Probably nothing." "What kind of message?" She hesitated, then met his eyes. "The kind people send when they think they know something you don't." "That's not an answer. It said," she began, choosing her words carefully, "that if I stay, I'll be your weakness." The room went still. Adrian didn't react immediately. His expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted. Subtle but unmistakable. "And what do you think?" he asked after a moment. Nina leaned back slightly, crossing her arms without realizing it. "I think people like to scare others when they don't understand what they're looking at. And you understand it?" "I understand what I see," she said. "You're recovering. You're trying to stand again. That's not weakness. That's not what they meant." "No," she admitted. "It's not." He watched her closely. "Say it." Nina held his gaze. "They meant you care, and that makes you vulnerable." A faint, almost humorless breath left him. "They're not wrong." She frowned slightly. "Caring about someone doesn't make you weak." "In my world it does," he said quietly. Nina shook her head. "Maybe that's your problem." His eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus. "Explain." "You built everything on control," she said. "On not needing anyone. On making sure no one could hurt you." She stepped closer, her voice steady but firm. "And look where that got you." He didn't interrupt. "You're here," she continued, softer now. "In a room full of people who work for you, but not one of them stayed with you the way I did." A pause. "That's not strength, Adrian. That's isolation." The words landed harder than she expected. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he looked away, toward the window, the light casting sharp lines across his face. "I didn't ask you to stay," he said. "No," she replied. "You didn't." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of something that had been building for days, weeks, maybe. "And yet," he said slowly, "you did." Nina nodded once. "I did." "Why?" The question wasn't casual. It wasn't defensive. It was real. She took a breath, then answered without looking away. "Because I saw something worth staying for." His gaze shifted back to hers, searching. "What?" he asked. "You," she said simply. The word hung in the air. Adrian let out a slow breath, something in his expression shifting again, not toward strength, not toward control, but toward something more exposed. "You're either very brave," he said quietly, "or very reckless. Maybe both." A faint hint of a smile touched his lips, the first real one she had seen from him. "Most people don't stay when things get complicated," he said. "Most people don't get the chance to choose," she replied. That seemed to settle something in him. After a moment, he shifted slightly, placing his feet on the floor again. "Help me up." Nina didn't hesitate. She stepped beside him, her hand steady at his arm and shoulder. "On 3. He nodded. 1, 2, 3. He pushed. This time, the movement was stronger, more controlled. His body still trembled slightly, but he held himself upright longer than before. Nina stayed close, but she didn't hold him unless he needed it. "That's it," she said quietly. "Stay there." He did. Seconds passed, then more. "See?" she added softly. "Not weak." Adrian exhaled slowly, his eyes focused straight ahead. "No," he said, "not weak." When he finally sat back down, his breathing was heavier, but his expression was different. Not just determined, resolved. He looked at her, really looked this time. "If staying makes you my weakness," he said slowly, "then leaving would make me something worse." Nina tilted her head slightly. "What's that?" "Empty." The words settled between them, heavier than anything else that had been said. Nina didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for the tray, placing the soup in front of him. "Eat," she said gently. "You're going to need your strength." He took the spoon, but his eyes stayed on her for a moment longer, and for the first time, neither of them pretended that what was happening between them was just part of the job. Outside, the afternoon light stretched across the estate, quiet and unchanged. Inside, something far less predictable had begun to take shape. By late afternoon, the house felt different. It wasn't louder, not in any obvious way. But something beneath the surface had shifted. Nina noticed it first in the staff, the way conversations stopped a second too quickly when she walked by, the way one of the drivers avoided eye contact altogether. Even Mrs. Lang, who rarely showed anything but controlled composure, seemed more measured than usual. Nina carried a folded blanket up the stairs, her thoughts still circling the message from earlier. She had deleted it, but the meaning lingered, pressing quietly against everything else she was beginning to feel. Weakness. The word followed her into Adrian's room. He was standing when she entered, not fully steady, not without effort, but standing. For a brief second, Nina froze in the doorway, the sight catching her off guard in a way she hadn't expected. Adrian stood near the edge of the bed, one hand resting lightly on the frame, his weight balanced more evenly than before. The afternoon light cut across him, outlining the tension in his posture, the strength returning where there had been none. "You didn't wait," she said softly. He glanced at her, a flicker of something pride, maybe passing through his expression. "You weren't here. So you decided to prove a point?" "I decided to stop asking permission from my own body." Nina stepped inside, setting the blanket down on the chair without taking her eyes off him. "That's not how recovery works," she said, though there was no real frustration in her tone. "You don't fight it like an enemy." He shifted slightly, steadying himself. "Then, what do I do?" "You work with it," she replied, moving closer. "You give it time to catch up." He held her gaze for a moment, then let out a quiet breath. "Time," he repeated. "Everyone keeps telling me that, because it's true." He studied her face, searching for something. "You always believe what you say, don't you?" "Yes. That must make things easier." "It doesn't," she said. "It just makes them clearer." A faint silence settled between them before Nina stepped closer, her hands instinctively hovering near his arm without touching. "How long have you been standing?" "Long enough to know I'm not going to fall immediately." "That's not an answer." 2 minutes, he admitted. Nina nodded slowly. "That's good," she said. "But you don't need to prove anything. I'm not proving it to you." She tilted her head slightly. "Then who?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted toward the window, where the fading light stretched long across the floor. "Myself," he said. Finally. That landed differently. Nina didn't respond with words this time. Instead, she stayed where she was, present but not intrusive, letting him hold that moment without interrupting it. After a few more seconds, Adrian's balance wavered just slightly. Nina stepped in immediately, her hand steady at his arm. "All right," she said gently. "That's enough for now." "I'm fine." "I know you are," she replied calmly. "But being fine doesn't mean pushing until you break." He looked at her, something in his expression softening again, and this time, he didn't argue. He let her guide him back to the bed, lowering himself with controlled effort. As he sat, he exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," she said, reaching for the blanket and draping it lightly over his legs. "It's just necessary." He watched her as she adjusted the fabric, his voice quieter now. "You're different when you're like this." "Like what?" "Focused," he said. "Certain." Nina gave a small, thoughtful smile. "That's because this part I understand. And the rest?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "The rest, I'm still figuring out." Adrian leaned back slightly, studying her in that quiet, deliberate way that had become familiar. You don't strike me as someone who's unsure of herself. That's because you only see me here, she replied, in a place where I know what I'm doing. And outside of this? She shrugged lightly. Outside of this, people make different choices. He watched her more closely now. You mean you've made the wrong ones? More than once, she said, her tone honest but not heavy. Haven't you? A faint breath left him, almost a laugh. More than I can count. Nina nodded, as if that confirmed something she already believed. Then you understand. Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like something shared, something understood, without needing to be explained further. After a moment, Adrian spoke again, his voice lower. When I was younger, I thought strength meant never needing anyone. He paused, his gaze drifting toward his hands. Now I'm not so sure. Nina leaned lightly against the edge of the chair, her arms resting loosely at her sides. Strength changes, she said. What matters is whether you're willing to change with it. And if you're not, then you stay exactly where you are. He looked up at her again, something sharper returning beneath the surface. I'm not staying here. I know, she said simply. That answer seemed to settle something in him again. A few seconds passed before Adrian spoke once more. You didn't answer the message, he said. Nina stilled slightly. What message? The one you told me about, he said. The one that said you'd be my weakness. She met his gaze, her expression steady. No, she said. I didn't answer it. Why not? Because I don't take instructions from people who won't show their face. A faint, approving look crossed his features. Good. She tilted her head slightly. You don't seem surprised. I'm not, he said. People like that don't send messages unless they're trying to control something. And you don't like being controlled. No, he said quietly. I don't. Nina studied him for a moment. Then don't let them. It's not that simple. It never is, she replied. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. He held her gaze, something deeper moving behind his eyes now. You really believe that, don't you? Yes. Even knowing who I am? Nina didn't hesitate. Especially knowing who you are. The words settled between them, heavier than anything that had come before. Adrian exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just slightly. You're going to make things complicated, he said. Things are already complicated, she replied. I'm just choosing where I stand in it. That answer stayed with him. Outside, the last of the daylight began to fade, leaving the room in a softer, quieter glow. Inside, the distance that had once existed between them felt smaller now, not gone, but reduced to something they could both see clearly. Adrian shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket Nina had placed over him. Help me again tomorrow, he said. I will. And the day after that. She nodded. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her, really looked this time, as if measuring the weight of that promise against everything else he had ever known. And for the first time, he didn't question it. Because somewhere between the silence, the struggle, and the small victories that no one else would have noticed, he had begun to understand something simple and dangerous at the same time. She hadn't stayed because she had to. She had stayed because she chose to. And that made everything different. That evening, the house no longer pretended to be calm. Nina felt it the moment she stepped out of Adrian's room to retrieve fresh linens. The air in the hallway carried something sharper than before. Something that didn't belong to routine or discipline. It was tension, quiet, controlled, but unmistakable. One of the men stationed near the staircase glanced at her, then quickly looked away. His posture stiffening, as if he had been caught doing something he shouldn't. By the time she reached the lower level, the feeling had settled deeper. Voices, low, restrained, but urgent. Nina slowed her steps instinctively as she passed the study. The door wasn't fully closed, just enough for sound to slip through. She didn't mean to listen, but she didn't walk away either. He's recovering faster than expected. A man's voice, not one she recognized. That's not the issue, another voice replied, calmer, colder. The issue is who he's recovering for. Nina's fingers tightened slightly around the folded linens in her arms. There's a girl, the first voice continued. The caregiver. She's with him constantly. A pause. Then, quieter, more deliberate. That makes her a variable. Nina didn't stay long enough to hear more. She stepped back, moving down the hallway with measured calm, but her heart had already begun to beat faster. Variable. It wasn't the same word as before, but it meant the same thing. Weakness. When she returned upstairs, Adrian was no longer sitting. He was standing again, this time closer to the window, one hand resting against the frame as he looked out over the darkening estate. The lights outside had begun to flicker on, lining the long driveway like something controlled, something watched. "You shouldn't be doing that alone," Nina said as she entered, her voice steady despite the thoughts still circling in her mind. "I didn't fall," he replied without turning. "That's not the point." He shifted slightly, then turned his head just enough to look at her. "Then what is?" Nina set the linens down, walking toward him. "The point is you don't have to prove anything every time I leave the room." He studied her for a second, then said quietly, "What if I'm not proving it to you?" She stopped a step away from him. "Then you're still doing it for the wrong reason." That caught his attention. "What's the right reason?" he asked. Nina met his eyes. "Because you want your life back, not because you're afraid of losing it." Silence followed. But it wasn't empty. It held something sharper now. Something shaped by the words she had just overheard downstairs. Adrian looked at her more closely. Something happened. It wasn't a question. Nina hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then sighed softly. "There are conversations happening in this house that don't include you," she said, "and they should." His expression didn't change, but the room seemed to tighten around him. "Who?" "I didn't see," she admitted, "but I heard enough." He turned fully now, shifting his weight carefully but with more control than before. "Say it." "They're talking about you," Nina said. "About your recovery. About me." His eyes sharpened slightly. "And what did they say about you?" "That I'm a variable," she replied. "That I change things." A quiet breath left him. Not surprise, confirmation. "That's what I thought," he murmured. Nina crossed her arms lightly, watching him. "You knew?" "I suspected," he said. "When people lose control, they start looking for what they can remove to get it back. And you think I'm something they can remove?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step forward. Nina didn't move, her eyes fixed on him as he closed the distance between them, each step measured, deliberate, stronger than the last. "They think you are," he said finally. "And you?" she asked quietly. He stopped just in front of her, close enough that she could see the shift in his breathing, the tension in his shoulders but also something steadier underneath it. "I think you're the only reason I'm standing right now," he said. The words landed heavier than either of them expected. Nina felt her chest tighten, but she didn't look away. "Then you understand why they're watching me?" "Yes. And you understand what that means?" "I do." "Then say it," she said. Adrian held her gaze, something darker, more focused, settling into his expression. "It means they're already planning something." Nina nodded once. "Exactly." Silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't uncertain, it was charged. Adrian exhaled slowly, then stepped back just enough to steady himself against the edge of the bed. "I should have seen this sooner." "You were busy surviving," Nina said. "That matters more." He shook his head slightly. "Surviving isn't enough anymore." "No," she agreed quietly. "It's not." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian straightened slightly, his posture shifting not just physically, but in something deeper. "They're not going to touch you," he said. Nina tilted her head slightly. "You don't know that." "I do," he replied, his voice low but certain. "Because if they try, they're not just dealing with a caregiver." "And what are they dealing with?" she asked. He met her eyes, something unmistakable in his expression now. The man they thought they had already taken out. That answer didn't feel like reassurance. It felt like a warning. Nina studied him carefully. "Adrian, whatever you're thinking, don't rush it." "I'm not rushing," he said. "I'm waking up." She stepped closer again, her voice softer but firm. "Then wake up smart, not angry." He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "You keep me from making mistakes. That's part of the job," she said lightly, though her eyes didn't leave his. He almost smiled. "No," he said. "That's something else." The room settled into a quieter stillness after that. But it wasn't the same quiet as before. It carried awareness now. A shared understanding that something had shifted beyond just recovery, beyond just care. Outside, the estate lights glowed steadily against the dark, but inside, something far less controlled had begun to move. Nina reached for the blanket again, adjusting it around him out of habit, grounding herself in the small, familiar motion. "You need to rest," she said. Tomorrow's going to be harder. He didn't argue. Instead, as he lowered himself back onto the bed, he kept his eyes on her, something steady and unspoken settling into place. "You're staying tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. Nina paused for a moment, then nodded once. Yes. And this time, neither of them pretended it was just because he needed care. Because somewhere between the whispers downstairs and the strength returning to his body, they both understood something clearly now. The danger wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was already inside the house. That night, the estate did not sleep. Nina felt it long before anything actually happened. It was in the way the hallway lights stayed on longer than usual, in the quiet footsteps that didn't belong to routine, in the subtle shift of air that comes when people start moving with intention instead of habit. She remained in Adrian's room, seated in the chair near the window, a book open in her lap that she hadn't read a single line of. Across from her, Adrian lay still, eyes closed, but she knew he wasn't asleep. "You're thinking too loudly," he said after a while, his voice low, almost amused. Nina didn't look up. "You're not asleep." "I didn't say I was." She closed the book slowly and set it aside, then stopped pretending. A faint breath escaped him, something close to a quiet laugh. When he opened his eyes, they were sharper than they had been all day. "You heard more than you told me earlier." It wasn't a question. Nina leaned back slightly, folding her arms. "Enough to know this isn't just about you recovering. And what is it about?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Control. Whoever's making decisions downstairs doesn't want you standing again. And they definitely don't want me here when you do." Adrian watched her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded once. "That narrows it down." "To who?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed himself up slowly, swinging his legs over the side of the bed with more ease than before. Nina moved instinctively to help, but he raised a hand slightly. "I've got it," he said. She stopped, but stayed close. Adrian stood, steadier than earlier, though the effort still showed in the tightness of his jaw. He took a few slow steps toward the window, his movements controlled, deliberate. Outside, the estate stretched into darkness, lit only by the long rows of security lights and the faint glow from the main gate. "They think I'm still weak," he said quietly. Nina crossed her arms, watching him. "You were. Not anymore." The way he said it made something in her chest tighten, not fear, not exactly, but awareness. He wasn't just recovering physically. Something else had come back with it. "Then what are you going to do?" she asked. Adrian didn't turn around. "I'm going to remind them." "That sounds like a bad idea," Nina said immediately. He glanced over his shoulder, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "You don't think I should take back control of my own house?" "I think you should be careful how you do it," she replied. "There's a difference." Silence settled between them for a moment before Adrian nodded slowly. "Fair." Nina stepped closer, her voice softer now. "This isn't just about power anymore, Adrian. If they're talking about me, it means they're already moving pieces around. And I don't know how many. That's exactly why I can't wait," he said. "And rushing is exactly how you make mistakes." He turned fully this time, facing her. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. "You don't trust me to handle this," he said. "I trust you to survive it," Nina answered. "I don't trust the people around you not to make it worse." That landed. Adrian studied her for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "You're right about one thing." "What's that?" "They're already moving." As if on cue, a sound broke through the quiet. Footsteps, not the soft, measured kind Nina had grown used to, but heavier, more deliberate, coming from the hallway. Both of them heard it. Nina's body tensed slightly. "You expecting someone?" "No." The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Then a knock, not polite, not hesitant, controlled. Adrian didn't move at first. His expression shifted into something colder, something that didn't belong to the man who had struggled to stand just hours ago. "Nina," he said quietly, without taking his eyes off the door. "Yes?" "Stand behind me." She didn't argue. She moved, positioning herself just slightly behind him, close enough to feel the tension in his shoulders, the steadiness that hadn't been there days ago. The knock came again. Adrian stepped forward and opened the door. Two men stood on the other side, both in dark suits, both unfamiliar to Nina. "That's far enough," Adrian said before either of them could speak. The man in front gave a small, polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We were told to check on you." "By who?" Adrian asked. "A mutual concern," the man replied smoothly. Adrian's expression didn't change. "You're in my house." "There's nothing mutual about that." A brief pause. Then the second man spoke, his tone less polished. "Things have been unstable. We just want to make sure everything is under control." "Everything is under control," Adrian said, his voice quiet but firm. The first man's eyes flicked past him for just a second, landing on Nina. That was enough. Adrian stepped slightly to the side, blocking the view completely. "You've seen what you came to see." The man's smile faded just a fraction. "We'll need to report back." "Then report this," Adrian said, his tone dropping just enough to carry weight. "I'm not the man you walked in here expecting." Silence stretched. For a moment, Nina thought they might push further, but then the first man nodded once. "Understood." They turned and walked away without another word. Adrian didn't close the door immediately. He waited, listening to their footsteps fade down the hallway before finally shutting it with a quiet click. The room felt different now. Sharper. Nina exhaled slowly, not realizing she had been holding her breath. "That wasn't just a check-in." "No," Adrian said, turning back toward her. "That was a warning." "For who?" He met her eyes. "Both of us." Nina crossed her arms again, her mind moving quickly now. "They weren't expecting to see you standing." "No. And they definitely weren't expecting you to push back." A faint, almost dangerous smile touched his lips. "Good. That's not something to be happy about," she said. "It is if it means they underestimated me." Nina shook her head slightly. "Underestimating someone doesn't make them less dangerous. It just makes them unpredictable." Adrian stepped closer, stopping just in front of her. "You're still here," he said. "It wasn't a question." Nina held his gaze. "I told you I would be." "Even now?" "Especially now." That answer settled something between them again, deeper this time. Adrian nodded once, slowly. "Then we do this together." Nina tilted her head slightly. "Do what?" He didn't look away. "Take back control." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything that had come before. Outside, the estate remained quiet, the lights steady, the walls unchanged. But inside, something had shifted beyond repair. The man who had been broken was standing again, and the people who had been waiting for him to fall had just realized he wasn't going to. By morning, the illusion of control was gone. Nina noticed it before she even reached Adrian's door. The house was awake earlier than usual, but not in the quiet, disciplined way she had come to expect. This was different. Staff moved faster, spoke less, and avoided lingering in open spaces. One of the security men she recognized from previous days was no longer at his usual post. In his place stood someone new, broader, colder, watching everything without pretending otherwise. Something had changed overnight. Nina didn't slow down. She carried the breakfast tray steadily through the hallway and pushed open Adrian's door without knocking. He was already dressed. Not just sitting, not just standing dressed. Dark slacks, a fitted shirt, sleeves rolled slightly at the forearms. He stood near the dresser, adjusting the cuff with controlled precision. For a moment, Nina simply stopped, taking in the sight of him not as a patient, but as something closer to the man the world had once known. "You're up early," she said. Adrian glanced at her in the mirror. "So are they." Nina stepped inside, setting the tray down slowly. "You felt it too." "I don't need to feel it," he replied. "I've seen this before." She crossed her arms lightly. "Then say it." He turned to face her fully, his posture steady, grounded in a way it hadn't been just yesterday. "They're not waiting anymore." Nina held his gaze. "Neither are you." A faint hint of acknowledgement passed through his expression. "No." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nina moved closer, lowering her voice. "What's the plan?" Adrian didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked toward the table and picked up a small device Nina hadn't noticed before, one of the internal communication receivers used by the security team. "You ever wonder why this house feels quiet even when it's full of people?" he asked. "Because no one wants to say the wrong thing," Nina replied. "Exactly." He turned the device over in his hand. "That kind of silence doesn't come from loyalty. It comes from fear." "And now?" He met her eyes. "Now we find out who's afraid of losing what." Before Nina could respond, the device in his hand crackled. A voice came through, low and controlled. Main hall, 10 minutes. Adrian didn't hesitate. He pressed the button once. I'll be there. The line went dead. Nina's chest tightened slightly. That didn't sound like a request. It wasn't, Adrian said. And you're going anyway. He looked at her, something firm settling into his expression. If I don't, I've already lost. Nina took a step closer. Then you don't go alone. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. This isn't your fight, he said. It became my fight the moment they started talking about me, she replied calmly. Adrian studied her, weighing something unspoken. Then he gave a small nod. Stay close. I always do. They left the room together. The hallway felt narrower than usual, the air heavier. As they moved toward the main hall, Nina noticed the subtle shift in attention eyes following them. Conversations cutting short, silence falling just a second too fast. By the time they reached the staircase, the house had already started to gather. Men in suits, some familiar, some not, all watching. Adrian didn't slow down. Step by step, he descended the stairs, his movement controlled, deliberate. Nina stayed just behind him, close enough to feel the strength in his stride, the absence of hesitation. At the bottom, the room opened up. The main hall stretched wide, polished floors reflecting the light from above. At the center stood a small group, 3 men, positioned like they had already decided how this would go. The one in the middle stepped forward, tall, composed, with the kind of calm that came from believing he already had the advantage. Adrian, he said, his tone smooth. Good to see you on your feet. Adrian stopped a few steps away. You sound surprised. I wouldn't say surprised, the man replied. Let's call it unexpected timing. Nina watched carefully, her attention moving between them. This is my house, Adrian said. There's no such thing as unexpected timing here. A faint smile touched the man's lips. That depends on who's making decisions. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind that comes before something breaks. Adrian took one step forward, then another, each movement steady, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I am, he said. The words landed hard. For a brief second, no one spoke. Then the man's eyes shifted just slightly toward Nina. Adrian noticed. He moved without hesitation, stepping just enough to block the line of sight completely. Look at me when you talk, he said, his voice lower now. The smile faded. Things have changed, the man said, while you were recovering. I noticed, Adrian replied, and some of us had to step in, make sure everything stayed stable. Adrian's expression didn't move. You mean you took what wasn't yours? We protected what you couldn't. The room went still. Nina felt it, the shift, the edge. Adrian didn't raise his voice. He didn't step back. Instead, he spoke quietly. Protection doesn't come with replacement. Then softer, colder. It comes with loyalty. The man held his gaze, but something in his posture shifted, just slightly. You think standing here changes that? He asked. Adrian didn't blink. No. Another step forward. I know it does. The distance between them closed, not enough to threaten, enough to make a point. Around them, the room had gone completely silent. Every eye fixed on the center, every breath measured. Nina stayed where she was, her presence steady, grounding. The man glanced past Adrian again, this time faster, less controlled. Adrian caught it immediately. You're still looking at the wrong thing, he said. And what should I be looking at? Adrian's voice dropped just enough to carry weight. The fact that I'm still here, that was the moment something broke. But in the way the man's confidence shifted, in the way the room adjusted, in the way control, real control, moved back to where it had been. Slowly, deliberately, the man stepped back. Then we'll adjust, he said. You will, Adrian replied. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed shape. The meeting ended without being called. One by one, the others stepped back, the space opening again, the pressure easing just enough to breathe. Nina exhaled quietly, only now realizing how tightly she had been holding herself together. Adrian didn't move immediately. He stood there for a moment longer, watching, measuring, reclaiming. Then he turned. His eyes found hers instantly, just understanding. They walked back together in silence. The house felt different now, not safe, not yet, but clearer. As they reached the top of the stairs, Nina spoke softly. That's not over. Adrian didn't slow down. No, he said, that was just the beginning. And for the first time, Nina believed it. Because the man who had been lying in that bed days ago was gone. And the one who had taken his place wasn't going to let anyone take anything from him again. The house did not return to normal after that morning. It settled into something quieter, but not calmer. The kind of quiet that comes when everyone understands the rules have changed. But no one knows exactly how far those changes will go. Nina felt it in the way doors closed more carefully, in the way conversations dropped the moment footsteps approached, in the way even the air seemed to carry a kind of cautious respect. Adrian didn't go back to bed. He remained on his feet longer than he should have, moving through the upper level of the house with deliberate control, reacquainting himself with a space that had briefly forgotten who it belonged to. Nina stayed close, not hovering, not interfering, but present in a way that had become instinct. "You should sit," she said at one point as he paused near the landing. "I will," he replied, though he didn't immediately move. "That's not what that looks like." A faint trace of something half amusement, half acknowledgement crossed his face. "You don't let things go, do you?" "No," she said simply. "Not when they matter." He glanced at her, then finally lowered himself into the chair near the window. This time, the movement was controlled, not forced. "That was different," Nina said quietly. Adrian leaned back slightly, his eyes still focused somewhere beyond the glass. "They expected me to hesitate. And you didn't." "No." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncertain anymore. It felt grounded, like something had settled into place. "They're not done," Nina added. "I know. And neither are you." He turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. "No." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian reached for the small side table, picking up his phone. He hadn't used it in days not like this. Now, his movements were precise. He dialed a number without hesitation. The line connected quickly. "Yeah," Adrian said, his voice calm, steady. "It's me." Nina watched him carefully, noting the shift not just in posture, but in presence. The man speaking now wasn't recovering. He was returning. "I want a full report," he continued. "Everything that moved while I was down. Names. Numbers. I don't care how small it looks." A pause. No delays. He listened, his expression unreadable. Then, quieter. "And one more thing. Anyone who stepped outside their lane doesn't get a second chance." The line went silent. Adrian lowered the phone slowly. Nina crossed her arms lightly. "That sounded final." "It is." She studied him for a moment. "You're not just taking control back. You're cleaning it out." "Yes." There was no hesitation in the answer. Nina nodded once, as if accepting something she already understood. "Then things are going to get worse before they get better." "They usually do." Another pause settled between them, heavier now. Nina stepped closer, her voice softer. "And where does that leave me?" The question wasn't fragile. It was direct. Adrian looked at her, really looked this time, as if measuring something beyond the moment. "Where you've been this entire time," he said. "Right here." "That's not an answer." "It is," he replied quietly. "You just don't like it." She exhaled slowly, shaking her head slightly. "I'm not asking where I stand in this room. I'm asking where I stand in your world." That landed differently. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting against his knees, his gaze steady. "You don't belong to my world." Nina's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "And that's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" she asked. "From you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood again, slower this time, more controlled, closing the distance between them until there was barely space left. "From everything that comes with me," he said. Nina held his gaze. "You don't get to decide that for me." A brief silence followed, charged but not volatile. "You stayed," he said quietly, "when you could have walked away." "Yes. You knew what I was. I knew enough. And you stayed anyway." Nina didn't hesitate. "Yes." The word hung between them. Adrian exhaled slowly. Something shifting again. Not toward distance this time, but toward clarity. "You're right," he said. "I don't get to decide that for you." Nina's shoulders eased just slightly. "Then don't," she replied. Another pause. Then Adrian reached out, not abruptly, not forcefully but with a kind of certainty that hadn't been there before. His hand found hers, steady, deliberate. "You stayed when I had nothing," he said, his voice low but clear. Nina's breath caught just slightly, but she didn't pull away. "And now?" she asked. He held her gaze, something unguarded surfacing beneath everything else. "Now I have a choice," he said. The words carried weight. Not power, not control. Nina's voice softened. "And what are you choosing?" Adrian didn't look away. "You." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had led them here, everything unspoken finally finding form. Nina studied his face, searching for hesitation, for doubt. She didn't find it. "You don't say things like that lightly," she said. "No. And you don't take them back." "No." A faint, almost disbelieving smile touched her lips. "Good." He exhaled quietly, something in his posture easing for the first time that day. Outside, the light had begun to shift again, the late afternoon stretching long across the estate. Inside, the tension hadn't disappeared, the danger hadn't faded, but something else had taken its place. Something steadier. Adrian's hand tightened just slightly around hers. "This isn't going to be easy," he said. "I didn't expect it to be. There are things you'll see, things you won't like." "I've already seen enough," she replied. "And you're still here?" Nina nodded once. "I told you I would be." He studied her for a long moment, then gave a small, decisive nod. "Then we finish this," he said. "Together," she added. "Together." The word settled between them, no longer uncertain, no longer fragile, because whatever came next, whatever was still moving in the shadows of that house, whatever consequences were waiting to surface, they would face it the same way everything else had been faced so far. And for the first time since any of this had begun, Nina understood something clearly. She wasn't staying because she had to. She was staying because she wanted to. And that made all the difference. Sometimes strength doesn't come from power, control, or the ability to stand alone. It comes from the quiet decision to stay when everything tells you to walk away. This story reminds us that real loyalty is not forced. And real love is not about possession, but about choice. In a world where fear often controls people, the greatest courage is choosing to trust, to care, and to stand beside someone not because you have to, but because you believe they are worth it. And in the end, true power belongs not to those who dominate others, but to those who know who they are and who they choose to protect. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.